Hello.
The Neighbourhoods and Environment Scrutiny Committee on this lovely day. I'd like to go through the agenda. So have we got any urgent items, Lee?
None received, Chair.
Any appeals?
Again, none received, Chair.
Any interests?
Yes, please. Yeah, can I just record my husband works for Biffa and there's a report on that today, so just making sure I've declared my interest again.
Thank you. The minutes of the last meeting in November, can we clarify that those minutes are correct?
Yeah, agree.
Seconded.
Thank you. Thank you. Now we're going to go on to item 5, which is the homelessness in the City of Manchester. We have invited two of the voluntary sector organisations to speak and to let us know what they've been doing. So we've got Joe Walby from Mustard Tree and we've got John Ryan from Shelter. Have we got them both here, Lee?
Chair, I'm just looking at the people who are currently in the room and it doesn't appear that they've joined this meeting.
Joe's on, I can see her.
Oh, yes, can see you. Joe, do you want to go ahead and introduce what you've been doing, and then the members can ask you some questions afterwards? Thank you.
Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. Ooh. Hello. Is that me? That's me, isn't it? Sorry, everyone. Hello, nice to see you.
Hi.
Apologies for being late on. So in terms of my name's Joe Walby. I work for the Mustard Tree. The Mustard Tree is a charity in Greater Manchester that is in Ancoats, but also in Little Holton and in Eccles. It's been around for 25 years. Predominantly, it started as a community shop and handing out food and clothing to people that were homeless by Dave Smith, who set it up. Most recently, in the last 2-3 years, we've had a big redevelopment of the Ancoats site. So we have a 30,000 square foot building in Ancoats, and we've really focused on our mission. And our mission is to combat poverty and prevent homelessness. So the combat poverty is deliberate. We're saying that it is not acceptable in 2020 and 2021 for the levels of inequality that is across Greater Manchester and is across our country. So we are proactively trying to hand at a pragmatic level as many opportunities as we can for people to get out of poverty. That could be through using their money further by using our food club where they pay £2.50 for 20 items, or it could be through buying furniture that is donated by members of the public. But then if you are on no income or low income, you get further discounts on what's in the shop. But on top of that, we also focus on training and helping people get into work, because it's about improving people's economic well-being as well as their health and well-being. The preventing of homelessness. So homelessness to us is the tip of the iceberg in terms of level of inequality and poverty. There are organisations that you'll all know, Coffee for Craig, the Booth Centre, Barnabas, that are brilliant and expert at working with people that are street homeless. Mustard Tree, really prior to the pandemic, was sort of one step away from that. So we would work with people once they had engaged with an agency and were looking at really sort of starting to turn their life around and either get into work or get into housing. With the pandemic happening, because we were a community shop model, in March we linked all our health and safety to the supermarkets in terms of the governance around that, with a real effort to try and keep open, because our instinct was that we already supported 500 people in Ancoats with food through our food club. A lot of those are pensioners. And obviously with isolation and issues like that, we were concerned that people wouldn't be able to get out and get food. So we made the decision to stay open to try and use our furniture vans that would collect furniture to then deliver food parcels to those people. And then we also kept our doors open because whilst the council were phenomenally successful and led very much by Nicola, Ray and the team at the council, as well as some of our charity partners in getting everyone in, there still was about 30 or 40 people that could not stay inside for reasons of typically addiction or chronic mental health issues, who were we were supporting at Mustard Tree. And this was between March and July on that pandemic. And we just supported them with food, sleeping bags, health, those sorts of things. Through that time, we went from seeing 500 people a month to 1,000 people a week around food. We worked with the council to deliver food parcels on behalf of the council's scheme of helping people that were shielding through health reasons. And we did that with massive support from the council, but also from people like Manchester United that paid for our food bills and other organisations there. Post-July, we then had the challenge around everything opening up again. Our expectation at that point would be that other charities, other services would open up, but we were naive in thinking that the world hadn't changed, and it had. One of the biggest changes for our cohort, so for people that don't have access to housing or to benefits or to money, people that may not or that live in Manchester that aren't comfortable at working on the phone and aren't comfortable at working on Zoom and stuff, they were still coming into Mustard Tree because obviously a lot of other services were still doing Zoom and we're doing Zoom and phone stuff. So we started to get overwhelmed with demand then. We saw 800 people that registered as homeless or temporarily housed. And the most we saw was 244 people in 4 hours that were coming through our doors for either food or emergency support around clothing or toiletries. In September, the brilliant news was that our charity sector, which is phenomenal in Manchester through the Housing Partnership, Homelessness Partnership, but the other charities all opened their doors, as did other services. And then that meant really from September, we focus now, or trying to focus more now back on training and economic support. So for the first time really since September, we're now using our hardship fund to pay rent arrears. We used to use our hardship fund to pay people for, if they had size 12 feet and they needed to get shoes and no one donated size 12 shoes, we would use our fund for that. We're now using our hardship fund to pay rent arrears. So our prevention of homelessness is really real now in terms of trying to maintain people in accommodation over winter. And that's absolutely our focus, is that we've got to keep people wherever they are over winter. And that way, hopefully we'll get through until March. Where we're focusing now is we've just secured some funding for our services from the DWP for next year. That's going to help us fund our freedom and our training services and our work placement services. That's obviously brilliant news for us because it gives us some stability around funding. Our turnover is 1.5 million. We get about £25,000 a year from Manchester Council, and we get less than that from GM. Most of the funding we get is from trust and grants. The National Lottery have given us some funding and that sort of stuff. I'm not asking for funding from the council, by the way. I'm just explaining how our funding model is. But what I am asking for the council is to really accelerate the work that Nicola Mike Wright was doing around transformation. More power to those people. I asked the council when Mike Wright was appointed that role, homelessness, should be critical and should report into the chief executive of the council, and that the homelessness directorate needs to have much higher priority within the council. Inequality needs to have a much higher priority within the council. I would just say more power to the elbow of the officers that are here. I don't mean to embarrass them, but I think they know what needs to be done. They just need the resources and the authority, actually, to be able to make those changes. And I think that's it, unless there's anything else anybody wants to ask.
Thank you, Jo. We'd like to thank you, the committee and the rest of the council in Manchester, but also the residents of the city. It's amazing what you've just told us, what you've been doing during the pandemic. We can't thank you enough. We also appreciate our officers and all the work they have to do. I don't think we understand the impacts, and that's one of the reasons why this scrutiny is here. It's awful that we haven't got the money to support the most vulnerable in society. That's what we're looking at today. And obviously we want to do the best that we can do. So I'll offer any of the members that'd like to ask Jo a question. If you've put your hand up on the screen, I can see it from the gallery. Does anybody that wants to ask any questions? Are you okay with that, everyone? Gavin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Joe, for your presentation and all the work that Mustard Tree has done for decades in the city. Actually, it's amazing work, and they do a lot of work, and not only to help those who are rough sleeping and homeless, but to actually prevent people becoming homeless, which I think is also part of what we should be really focusing on as a council. My question was just to reflect on what you said about lockdown, and has the nature of the need changed since March for those who are homeless and rough sleeping? Or is it just the same issues that were before lockdown, but in a greater intensity? And what else could the council and us do to support charities such as yourself? Thank you.
So that's a brilliant question. I think it's really insightful because there has been a lot of support put in by Manchester Council around homelessness. I mean, if you see nationally or you see what Greater Manchester and Manchester has done around homelessness, and has done actually well before my time. I've only been at Mustard Tree 3 years, so I'm a custodian of Mustard Tree. So thank you for those kind words. But you know, I'm very much a custodian of what Mustard Tree's done. And what I would say is what I've seen was typically the reasons around addiction, relationship breakdown, mental health, not necessarily being able to get into mental health services, so not being stable. Those were traditionally the reasons around homelessness. I think from the pandemic, I've started to see things like nurses, you know, that I had a nurse that came in that later on in the pandemic couldn't cope, had left the NHS, but and had, for whatever reason, left her parents and got herself into trouble money-wise. And she was coming in to use our food club and saying that normally she helps people, and this time she was actually having to come for help. We're seeing people that are losing their job, and what gets me is they're quiet people. So the noisy people that we know about, we'll all know, Mike and Nicola will know these guys. They're one thing, and they're the guys in the hotels. What I'm seeing a lot more of is people that are quiet, that are coming in, that are 6 weeks, 8 weeks away from, you know, that have lost their job 6 weeks ago, use their spending, use their money to pay in hotels, and then trying to get support and trying to find a way of getting into help. And one of the challenges is that debt is not a debt. If you have debt, then you don't automatically have a right to have housing, and debt is now, I would argue, the number one cause that we're seeing of people coming in, which is why we are paying rent arrears and why we are paying for people to stay in, because the council you've got to worry about the statutory duty. But the argument I always have with Nicola and Mike is that we've got the whole people that you need to support from a statutory point of view, and then we've got all those people that, you know, are homeless because of debt, that are homeless because they've got failed asylum seekers that are still on our streets. So yes, it definitely it is starting to change. I don't think we've hit that tsunami yet. I think it's February, and again, I think colleagues that have worked in this space will know February is always the worst time because it's after Christmas. It's after the January time, and there's a bit of compassion fatigue. I don't know why, but the weather's awful. So I think January and February is when we're going to start feeling it there. We are seeing deaths now, I dare say that. We had somebody that's passed away recently that's well known in the homeless community. Is that more than last year? I'm not sure yet. It is, but you know, we're starting to see that, and that's obviously the worst case scenario. In terms of what can be done, I think things like drug and alcohol services have been cut sort of through three iterations of funding over the last sort of 8-12 years. I don't hold the council to account for that. I hold the government account to that. And the reason why I hold the government account to that is because the council's got to cut 10%, 20% or whatever. But there is obviously a correlation. If you can't get people into rehab or scripts, or you can't get people into support around addiction, and those earlier prevention services are the first that tend to get cut, and they're not there, then you will have a bigger issue around addiction. We have a drug issue in Manchester, I think, as well as, you know, we might even say more than a homeless issue. I don't know, but so can we reprioritise addiction services? I think there's some of that work's going on already. There's some work around health and homelessness that's happening, I think, in the council. But can we reprioritise the sort of health and equality services, I suppose? I think there's an argument we should be much more aggressive about the fact that the NHS get funding, but why do the local authorities not get funding? So why are drug and alcohol services funded out of out of local authority, not NHS? Is there not something that you guys can lobby on about that? Planning, You know, so planning, if we're still doing planning for housing that isn't affordable, you know, why is that still going through planning? Can you set a direction around planning? You know, can you set the strategy and the vision and the values around planning so that we have more genuinely affordable housing in the city? I could go on forever, and I know you've not invited me forever, but I think the fact that you've called this and you've invited me and John and to this call is showing that there are people people care. We just need to be more vocal about it, I think, about that maybe. And I'm sure you are anyway, but as I say, thank you for inviting me to have my rant as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I've got Councillor Richard Kilpatrick, then Councillor Paula Appleby would like to ask you a question, and Councillor Annette Wright. Richard?
Thanks, Leanne, and thanks, Joe, and thanks, John. I know that we haven't heard from John yet, but I just wanted to come back on one point that Joe just made on debt as well, because I think anecdotally, even in the most wealthiest wards, we're noticing an increase in the number of working homeless. So a lot of people in their cars. Often, you know, the Reach Out group in South Manchester will approach people who are clearly sleeping in cars, and these people are working, they're still registered to a nearby address. I think that's like a hidden element of it. There's obviously some mental health wellbeing outreach that's clearly required there, and it's falling onto the voluntary sector at the minute for various reasons. But I just wanted to ask Joe and John, I know we haven't heard from yet, but of just like first-hand opinions of the Everyone In strategy, because from speaking to volunteers, I think it's always been the dream to approach this sort of service from a need first and assessment afterwards. You know, let's get that provision there, let's deal with that initial need, and then assess and decide next steps afterwards. And I think there's often in the past, the council, for whatever reason, has had wings clipped in their approach. And I think, ironically, the horrendous nature of the pandemic forced the work into a certain way. And it'd be interesting to get your views of how well the Everyone In approach has worked, both from a housing and also from a frontline service perspective.
John, do you want to say something rather than me ranting?
You're on mute.
There's always one, isn't there?
John, you can introduce what you do at Shelter, and then I can bring the other members in. Is that all right? Yeah, of course it is. Thank you.
I'll stay off mute. So I'm John Ryan. I manage shelter services across Greater Manchester. As you probably know, that Shelter is a national organisation. However, we are local. We've been in Manchester for 25 years. And we ostensibly started off by delivering advice within the city, so which we still deliver, and we are part funded for that advice by the City Council via a partnership with the Citizens Advice Bureau. And we bring every year, well, up until this year, 1.7 million. Last year it was over 2 million into the city in terms of other funding sources as well, and our own voluntary income that we bring to the city as well. The advice and support that we offer and provide is around housing, homelessness, debt, welfare benefits, and obviously one of the major challenges around the delivery of that advice and support has been COVID and the pandemic hitting us, and we had to move to remote working like many others did. All of our teams are now working from home, and yet the numbers of people that are coming through to us, even with the front doors closed, has increased exponentially over the period of last March right the way through to now. The lockdown obviously has impacted the way that we operate and the way that we work. Our helpline, which is run out of Sheffield, which is a national helpline, we've had over 4,300 calls since March to that helpline around housing issues. 1,500 of those have been from families, some of whom have been already homeless or at severe risk of homelessness. And we also deliver support services as well, which include the entrenched sleeper service. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the entrenched sleeper service and Inspiring Change Manchester. So Inspiring Change has been working with over 600 people over 8 years. We're into the 8th year in March 2021, and that has always been about helping those 600 people, but understanding from their experience why people with multiple and complex needs find it difficult to navigate the system, and what about the system is blocking them or stopping them from finding the solutions that they really need to turn their lives around. I talked to my teams to sort of get a good idea of what they're really sensing at the moment. So an increase in homelessness, especially because of debt, including rent arrears, as a result, very often of redundancy. You know, what was affordable yesterday in our increasing private rented market in Manchester is not affordable today for people who've lost their jobs. Domestic abuse and couples separating. You know, this isn't just about families falling out because they're having to live together for longer. This is about serious abuse that's happening and people having to flee that abuse. Young people having to move out of family homes due to breakdown of the family relationships. There's also, we're finding it really difficult as a support, as an advice team, to access kind of access homeless accommodation especially for women. That is quite limited for women, although there is women specific provision. It is kind of quite difficult at times to get into that provision. Those with a positive COVID diagnosis have had a number of experiences of really finding it quite challenging to get a solution for people with the positive COVID diagnosis, and young people without high needs as well. Accommodation wise, the biggest things that we're seeing for people who are accommodated is that critical loneliness, leading to depression and increased mental health issues, and that was mentioned a minute ago. The reduction of face-to-face interventions from statutory services who are not doing home visits, and therefore, again, mental health and physical health is deteriorating, and we're seeing more and more people in more and more acute situations. The street homeless community, reduction in open public facilities. You know, the kind of just the simple things like trying to keep clean, not having those facilities to do that. So there's some of the things that we've seen within our support services. I think just as a general kind of overview of how we see this as an organisation, you know, you can't solve homelessness without homes, and we're just simply not building enough social housing, enough affordable housing. Our private renting market, as I've already said, is going through the roof. It's becoming increasingly unaffordable. There's often a gap for people who are on a significant gap for people on benefits to try and bridge that gap. DHP helps, or discretionary housing payments do help with that gap, but you know, obviously that's not going to be able to go on forever. There's the whole issue of the hole in the bucket. So not only we're not building enough social housing, but the right to buy is seeing what we are building being cancelled out. And actually in many cases more than cancelled out. So we're selling more than we're building in the right to buy. And you know, one of our kind of internal asks and asks of other areas as well is for to considering temporary suspension of right to buy as a way of balancing the need for social housing. Obviously, the Homeless Reduction Act was introduced a few years ago. Prevention and relief is in place. But based on the pressure of not having enough move-on facilities for people, a lot of the system is silting up. Hostels, we've got 1,600 plus people, and that's in, I think, Nicola and Mike's report. We've got 1,600 plus families in dispersed temporary accommodation, over 200 singles in dispersed temporary accommodation. We need to be able to move people on into more secure and safe homes and solutions. I think I mentioned the entrenched sleeper service before. Obviously, there's the Housing First service, both of which are Greater Manchester wide, but have a massive impact on Manchester citizens. The short-term approach to that funding, though, is one of the biggest issues that we face. Social impact bond or entrenched sleeper service ends in December, so it ends at the end of this month. Just in Manchester alone, so you've got the figures, over 124 entrenched rough sleepers were housed by the Social Impact Bond Entrenched Rough Sleeper Service. Over 81 of those are still in accommodation, which I think is a phenomenal outcome for people who are in trench of sleepers and are considered, in many cases, had been through the system many times and it hadn't worked for them. And again, Housing First is in its currently in its final 14 months of delivery as well. So again, it's what happens when all of that ends in the midst of further cuts that you're having to consider now as councillors as well. Private renting, I've already talked about the issue of increasing private rents, but there's also something that is happening as well, that people are falling behind with their rent because of their circumstances, as I said, because of redundancy, but also because of there is some intentional non-payment of rent going on, and some of this is linked to the fact that there's a stay on evictions. So we are seeing examples, and I know Nicola has seen examples of where people are just not paying their rent or stopping paying their rent because, quote, they can't be evicted at the moment. That builds up problems for the future, for when they eventually, when the stay of evictions and the truce over Christmas ends, what happens then for those people when they become homeless? And then are turning up to make a homeless application, but they're not eligible because of the rent arrears to be rehoused. So it's just some of these problems that we're seeing now, that there's a bit of a tsunami that's coming around the corner. And I think again, just to mention the stay on rent arrears, it was very positive when it happened. It was needed to prevent people losing their homes through a public health emergency, but it's building up problems for the future, because, as I said before, if people can't afford their rent because of losing their job, what happens again when the evictions come back online and they find themselves in really difficult situations? I could go on. Demand is likely to increase, as you, I'm sure, well know, after the stay and truce on evictions. The advice cuts that the government, the government are asking councils to make cuts. Obviously, you're having to look at advice and support, and clearly that will impact on the prevention agenda and affordable homes. I can't say that enough. We need in this city more affordable homes, both social and private renting. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, John. That was very emotional to listen to people suffering through that critical isolation and loneliness, that you wouldn't think that in 2020 that loneliness was one of the biggest issues that the pandemic caused to increase that loneliness. It's heartbreaking to know that people just feel so lonely because of this pandemic. I'd like to thank you again. I just think it's marvellous what people have done for so many across the city, and I know the officers are working with you. So I've got Councillor Paula Applebaum, Councillor Annette Wright to come in. If there's anybody else that wishes to ask John a question, or Joe, can you indicate? Thank you. Paula?
Thanks, Leanne. Yeah, I mean, obviously we can't thank you enough. I think Leanne's just obviously made that point, and I'm sure the committee obviously share that view. I think you're right. I think the number of new homes that are needed, like you say, are just phenomenal in relation to the numbers. I mean, there's some. Can I ask a question on the report at this stage, Leanne, or do you want me to wait?
Wait, Paula, if you could just ask John or Joe
okay,
a question.
that's fine. Okay, and as you say, I think one of the things that we will see is this huge increase in February, and it's understanding how we need to prepare ourselves for that. So really, my questions are more around for what the officers can do to support yourselves, obviously, as we move into the new year and we get out of this phase of the protection that is obviously in place. So I'll wait and ask those questions, but thanks again.
Thank you.
Annette?
Yeah, I think mine possibly crosses over, but I would just be interested in your opinions, really. Some of this has been covered in what you've already said, and some of it is kind of not in the terms that I'd like to understand it. So there's people who, during the Everyone In provision, some people were evicted from hotels, and then there's been other people who at various stages have just said that they don't want the help. And we know there are people now sleeping on the streets again who are being offered help and either can't or won't accept some of what's being offered. So, especially over the winter, what is the provision for those people? What will they be offered? What will they be entitled to? And what can people do specifically to help them? Because I know we've got a lot of residents who are really desperate to help some people in this situation, and they just don't know what to do for the best. And my other question was just, even if it's just anecdotally, the impact of discretionary housing payment that the council's been able to provide for people. Do you have anything you can say on that as to how many people you think you've seen that a discretionary housing payment is what stopped them from becoming homeless and then potentially going into very expensive homelessness provision? So just if you've anything to say on either of those things. But as everyone said, thanks very much for everything that you're doing.
Are you okay to come in, John?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have exact numbers on people who've actually benefited. I mean, obviously we see a high number of people coming for advice who are very often they're at risk of losing their home. So either the DHP isn't bridging the gap for them, or that their income has dropped in other ways as well. So, but I don't have the actual figures on that. But what I would say is that the use of discretionary housing payments has prevented probably hundreds, maybe thousands of people becoming homeless and needing much more kind of expensive homelessness services over the past year. I'm sure Nicola and Mike could probably make a better kind of.
Come in, Mike.
Thank you, Chair, and just to reiterate my thanks to Joe and John for coming today, but actually for everything that they do. That a lot of the work that they do, I know they we all slightly take for granted, really, and the situation in Manchester would be considerably more difficult were it not for these two agencies in particular, but also all the other voluntary sector agencies who support so much of what we're trying to do as a council. But also I think I was going to make a couple of general points anyway, but just to pick up the point that Joe made around the statutory and non-statutory people and the issue of hidden homelessness, which I know is something that the committee's been concerned about in the past, and it's about stitching together a safety net which meets as many needs as possible. And actually, no one agency can deal with everybody, nor should they. And actually, we fulfil different parts of the system, and I think that's working better. I just wanted to pick up on Councillor Applby's point around effectively talking around cold weather provision. And yeah, we know that people are more likely to come inside in winter time than people who wouldn't do at other points of the year. And looking at that, I think the way that we've tried to adapt different types of accommodation, and there are some lessons to be learned from everyone in here around what is it that triggers people to come in, and there are things around quality of accommodation. So in terms of cold weather, our additional provision this year, I think it's in the report, we're looking at commissioning an extra 70 units of accommodation that we're going to fund, that will include an element of kind of hotel rooms of vacant capacity. And what we do this every year, and we actually go above what the statutory level is, where we're supposed to get people in if the weather's going to drop below zero for 3 days. We do it for 1 day, and critically, I think what we're trying to do is not just to get people in for that point, but to do something positive with them when they're in, to reduce the numbers of people who come back onto the streets. That can be really difficult, but what everyone in, and to a degree a bed every night, has enabled us to do is to spend more time with people. And actually the point I think that was made earlier around accommodation and then assessments, I think there are some lessons that we're learning there around what that actually means in terms of getting people engaged and critically getting an outcome for them at the end. I did want to just make the point, it runs through a little bit of what I think both Joe and John were saying around kind of transformation of how we're looking to develop our services is around looking at outcomes rather than process, and the statutory process itself is quite a blunt tool and does not always deliver positive outcomes for lots and lots of people, and people can be really disappointed with the statutory process because people fall out of it. And actually shifting towards something which is about what do people need to sustainably end their homelessness and put them in a better position not to be homeless again is where we should be. That is a really difficult thing to do when the mismatch between supply and demand is so great, but that's effectively what the kind of tack that we're trying to move towards within the council's own service. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Joe and John for explaining what their both agencies do. It's marvellous. It's just awful that we're in this situation and we can't give you what you need to help the most vulnerable in the city. And as councillors, it's our role to make sure that we spend the city's budget and try and help as much as possible. But also from some of your information today, we'll be asking for some recommendations and also going to our MPs to lobby some of the information that you've given us, because it's important to us, obviously, that we save lives and we give people the best opportunities. So thank you very much for attending. You're welcome to stay on if you'd like to. You don't have to, because we're just going to go on to the rest of the meeting. So on behalf of all the councillors on this committee and the councillors and officers, thank you very much for all your hard work, and all the other voluntary sector who deal with homelessness. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're going to go straight into questions now. I've got 6 people waiting. I've got Gavin, Tim and Sam. So Gavin, if you want to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you for the report. On item 3 on section 21, evictions, it follows on a little bit from the first part of the meeting, but it shows that section 21 evictions has risen, sadly, since earlier in the year. And can you outline what work is going on with the Housing Solution Service to support people around these evictions? And as the report talks about, help them to get help early, because obviously we believe prevention is the better way to try and stop people becoming homeless in the first place. So can you just outline a bit more about what the Housing Solutions team are doing to prevent section 21? Thank you.
If the officers can come into that, thank you.
Yeah, happy to say that. I know this has been an issue that the committee raised in the past, and is a much more live issue given the change in demographics around the housing stock in the city, with a great proportion of private rented. So the committee will be aware that we took on a dedicated Section 21 team of people with more specialist knowledge and understanding of some of the difficult track sometimes of the Section 21 eviction process. To be clear, Section 21 is no fault eviction, so people don't necessarily need to have done something to enable, to warrant being evicted or landlord taking possession of their property. This can be simply mandatory. And what we have found, so in terms of bring that team online, their job is to try and prevent people who are in that situation, where sometimes there is absolutely no defence against that, coming into the full gamut of the council's statutory homelessness process, i.e. going into temporary accommodation, going through the whole statutory process, which can take a long time, can be very costly and not always guarantee great outcomes for people. But also, where possible, to challenge those Section 21 notices. And I think it does reference in the report that a number of them are found to be invalid. So some landlords some of the less professional ones, issue invalid notices. You would not know, and no tenant would necessarily know that a notice was invalid. And it's our job to try and use that time then to go back to the landlord, either to negotiate keeping that household in that property, and sometimes there are ways that we can do that. But if not, to work with them to find a solution, which means that they don't then come into temporary accommodation, which is going to be based on what is available at the time. But actually, we prevent their homelessness by moving them seamlessly into another property without them having to come into the full service. And actually, the team has been really successful with that. And I know this was a question that was raised last time, and we're certainly intending to retain the services of that team as far as we possibly can do as the service moves forward.
Thank you.
Are you okay with that, Gavin?
Yeah.
Have you got any more questions, or is it just that one?
I've got another one, but let other people have their questions first, and then I'll come back at the end.
Oh, fine. Tim?
Thank you. I'm having a few audio problems, so I do apologise if I'm saying anything I've missed. Thank you for the reports and for the work that everyone's been doing. I think obviously the homelessness issue really is related to a number of things, but housing is one of them. And I had a recommendation, which was when we get a future housing report to the committee, that we have an update on the new housing allocations, which we were advised this time last year would be reviewed at 3, 6 and 9 months. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Because that's for a different executive, I'll put that as recommendations at the end. We've now got Sam Lynch.
Thank you, Chair. So when I was reading the report, something I found interesting in it was that as footfall and begging opportunities fell, the amount of people that wanted to come forward to get some sort of help with substance and addiction services and help with that went up. So when things do start to go back to, well, some sort of normal, how can we ensure that people who need these services will still engage with them? And for the people that do want to help, how do we encourage them from maybe doing that in a way that might hinder their chances of rehabilitation? And do that in another way? How can we get them to help in a way that's more helpful to the people? Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. If the officers want to come in.
Yeah, sorry, I think that's a really good question actually, and part of the learning that the directorate's taken and the homeless partnership taken in the city from what COVID has done. I think one of the critical things for us is around messaging and really strong messaging around ways that people can help people. People are motivated to help. People are genuinely wanting to help people, and I think that link between accessibility of things which can enable people to stay on the streets and people being able to take up those opportunities is one that I think we've really learned. We would certainly want, I'm sure, and I know that Councillor Raman and I have had lots of conversations around the way that schemes like Big Change operates and how we can make the best of that function where people can donate to a charitable arrangement where people actually can make a real difference to people by very, very practical things rather than giving money, giving food, etc. to people when they're on the street in a way which can facilitate, even if it's just for that night, and then tomorrow is the same, it's that night as well, and the day after is the same, it's that night as well, if people can survive day to day. And that can be quite a harsh message. There are nuances about how we do that, but I think that's the critical thing, and that's probably something, I know I think a number of members on the committee will be aware of things that we've done around the kind of the day of action in Withington, and I think what we have seen is as the city centre, which was the hub of kind of rough sleeping and street begging, has changed and closed down during lockdown, that some of that activity has cropped up, particularly some of our district centres and some of our outlying wards in ways that never happened before. And I think so some of that messaging needs to be more of a citywide offering, and perhaps a change in focus away from the city centre, although with we have no Christmas markets this year, but we do have 24/7 shopping in the city centre. It'll be really interesting to see the impact that that has.
Thank you. Are you okay with that, Sam?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Can I just remind members and the rest of the panel, if you are speaking, can you have your camera on as well as your microphone, please? Thank you. I've now got Azra.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions, so I'll go with two and then come back after, if that's okay. So the first one is on point 2.0, the homeless presentation. It's what are the reasons given for presentation? Any chance you can elaborate on these, as I'm extremely concerned that from this report the figures are not going down? And has this government given any additional funding to cope with this ever-increasing demand? And the next question is on point 4. And in terms of specialist pathways, are we able to meet current demand as this need is growing at an alarming rate? And will we be able to continue to provide this service?
If the officers can come back.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, we do have presentation reasons, and we can provide that data. I mean, historically, the greatest reasons for presentation in the city have always been accommodation, varying positions, 1, 2 or 3 between domestic abuse, family and other relationship breakdown, but increasingly eviction or loss of a private rented tenancy. So there certainly will be the top 3, but we can provide that information to the committee. No, we've had no specific additional funding from government over on top of what we get. When the Homelessness Reduction Act was brought in, there was some additional new burdens funding which has been allocated that did not cover the additional costs of implementing that legislation, but has been retained by the government, and we wait to see what the final settlement is from the spending review the other week. The point section 4 around kind of housing related support services is to answer the question, do we have enough, is really difficult, because it isn't just access to the beds in those units themselves. It's being able to make the most of those by enabling people to get out and move on into permanent tenancies. And actually that's sometimes the bit that we are struggling with, particularly as most of our housing related support is for single people who will be looking for 1-bedroom accommodation, which is incredibly scarce in the city. And when we have more, in total, we have more kind of emergency beds and cold weather beds than probably we've ever had before in the city. The issue is not so much stacking those beds up as being able to get people out when people are ready to move. And when people have done that work, got themselves to a point where they're ready to move on, it can be a real loss to the system if we can't do that quickly. And sometimes it's access to that move on to free up that bed for somebody else that's the critical issue rather than the totality. But it's a really good question to ask.
Thank you. Now I've got Paula.
Thanks, Leanne. I think there was a lot of really useful information in this report, but you can clearly see that it still remains a huge challenge going forward. Some people have already asked some of the questions that I was going to ask, so I'll try and stick to ones that haven't been asked already. I think the other thing just to think about is the demand. Obviously, we'll see an increase as we move into the new year. How prepared are we for that in relation to having enough support, obviously, to get people into temporary accommodation, if that's what will be required? And again, obviously, how we'll try and prevent some of that is a key issue. And I think the other thing around addiction support, so where we're not getting people from the streets into some form of temporary accommodation with support, as we move through more horrendous, Tory cuts that possibly come into us again, then how do we look at addiction support and actually dealing with the actual root cause issues which I'm sure Nicola, and I know she's done a tremendous job, and the team, and I wonder how they are really. From an MCC point of view, how are the team doing, which has been under really difficult circumstances, having to still go out and do this job. So I echo support for those staff as well, to hope we're doing our best by them as well. But I think the key issues for me, have we got enough when the demand increases? And really, how can we increase that addiction support, and really start to really tackle some of the root causes of getting some of the long-term people support to actually get off the streets, because I think that's one of the issues. And you're right, there's people in a city who see in their own wards, you talk to and say, you know, do you want to get some support? And you know that they seek support, they've had that support, and it just doesn't work for them. And I haven't got the answer, by the way. And then you see on page 12 of the report, it'd be good to see the year-on-year comparisons of really how well are we doing on the presented October 31st, 1,630 families and 215 single people in temporary accommodation, and you've got 40% 1 year to and so on. How are we doing on that? Are we is it increasing? Is it getting any better? Not for now, but it'd be good to see some comparisons in future reports, just to see, is the demand worse? And I totally echo Leanne's point about lobbying our MPs, because this is a national issue, not just something that can be resolved locally. And I thank you, Nicola, and the team for all the hard work.
The officers want to come back, Nicola?
Yeah, certainly. We can definitely provide a year-on-year comparison, but the numbers are going up. So I can tell you that now, but we will provide those figures to show that. With addiction support, we are quite lucky in that we were chosen by MHCLG in order to be one of the Protect programme areas. So that is in this report. We actually had to bid for money. I think one of the problems that we do have at the moment is that a lot of our money is short-term funding, which we then have to bid for, and then within a very, very short space of time, bring services up very quickly, and then the money runs out and the services close. So one of the things that would be wonderful that we talk to MHCLG about is that actually it would be nicer to have a more stable, longer term pot of money that we can actually strategically manage rather than lots of short term bids. But nevertheless, we have been successful with the Protect programme, and we have just under 454,000 to actually spend on a very small cohort of people who are those really entrenched people on the streets who we've tried everything with, and so what we've asked is that we actually get the funding for additional social workers, additional mental health workers, and additional drug and alcohol support, in order to really provide a wraparound service for a very small cohort of people, in order to try and help them come off the street and sustain accommodation. Unfortunately, that funding is only until March, so it is a very intense piece of work, and part of the question is, how do we then continue that? But we are talking with MHCLG around whether or not we can actually then continue some of that funding in a different bid, an RSI bid, that we will be looking at in the new year. Nevertheless, that is one of the ways in which we're actually trying to ensure that we can actually help support people who have these significant addiction and mental health issues. What we really need, though, is that long-term ongoing support, which means that people are actually able to engage with people on the streets far more. We have actually invested more in a mental health team who will actually come out onto the streets and engage with people, which has made a huge difference because people on the streets really struggle with CBT and other mental health services. But nevertheless, that's where we are at the moment around trying to get that additional support in.
Thank you, Nicola. Now I've got John Connor.
Thanks for that, Chair, and thank you, Mike, Nicola and Wuffa, for the detailed report. It's good to see all the work that not only the council do, but obviously all the partners that we hear in the homelessness partnership. It's good to see all that brilliant work in one place. Obviously, we heard from some of the partners today. I know the pandemic has provided new challenges to the council and some of those charities and partners. I just want to say thank you from myself about all the hard work that's been going on over the last year in particular to rise to those challenges. I know with the Everyone In scheme, it was a real effort to get people to accept that help, but you rose that challenge. It's good to see outlined in the report specialist provision for those with substance abuse issues and those with bespoke needs in relation to homelessness and support, such as LGBT people and women. Nicola made a really good point around the funding that the council gets. I was speaking to Councillor Jevons on this earlier today. The funding just isn't consistent, and therefore the progress that can be made within a period of time can stop so abruptly, and obviously that can be disruptive to the good progress that can be made. I've just got two questions, one for Mike and Nicola and then one for Wuffa. The first one is, I'm still uncertain about where I can refer people out of hours. If someone approaches me, in the city centre, someone I see approaches me asking for change for accommodation, for money for accommodation, at 7 p.m. on a Thursday, for example, where can I refer that person to get help right then and there? That's a situation that many people find themselves in if they're going through the city centre or, somewhere, outside some shop somewhere in the city. That's a situation many people find themselves in, and they want to help and they want to refer them to the right place. But that's a question many people ask themselves. And then a question for Wuffa. Councillor Kilpatrick mentioned that the council has clipped wings, and I think we all know what that is, and I think it's important to address it. That we've seen huge cuts in Manchester, but also across the country from national government over the last 10 years. The Conservatives, I know, in the 2019 general election manifesto pledged to end rough sleeping by 2024. Of course, this is incredibly ambitious and a welcome pledge, but I haven't heard anything since the general election, however, on this. I haven't had sight of a new strategy to meet this new target or a plan. So my question to Wuffa is, have you seen that strategy? Have you had any communication from ministers about a plan to meet that new goal? Thank you.
Thanks. If the officers, then Councillor Rahman can come in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Lyons. Yeah, just in terms of kind of out of hours provision. So there are a couple of routes. So for people who are obviously rushing, there is a duty phone for the Russ Sleepers team that's on. Well, we can provide all the data as part of the minutes rather than give the numbers out directly now. But there's a duty phone that lasts until 8 o'clock. For any statutory homelessness housing solutions queries, there is an out of hours numbers that clicks on at 4:30, which is the 5001 number. For homeless applicants, those calls are directed to staff from the Directorate who are currently based at the Longford Centre to carry out an assessment, and that can lead to immediate access to accommodation. For example, we've got bed every night vacancies, and women who are calling at that time put through to our and dealt with through our Women's Direct Access Centre. So it's a gender specific service to that group of people, and those services operate right through to the reopening of services at 9 o'clock the following morning. Obviously within the city centre there are now so Coffee Craig are open till 8 o'clock on a weekday night and 7 o'clock at a weekend to provide support. They can often do some of the working with people who are presenting there. But I will note that down to officers for the minutes, so that's consistently seen by members of the committee.
Thank you, Lufter.
Yeah, as the previous speakers have said, and Joe and John came and talked about some of those services and the 10 years of austerity that we've had, and those wraparound services, addiction services, mental health provision, and all of those provisions that we need in order to be able to support people come off the streets and out of homelessness and into more permanent and stable accommodation hasn't been very forthcoming, and we've not seen any additional resource or funding come from government. This government has had a lot of rhetoric around ending homelessness by 2024, and you can see with their approach towards the pandemic and the Everyone In scheme, whereas in the first round of the lockdown we had funding to be able to accommodate people in hotels and other accommodation. We extended that funding till October when they finished in June. In the second round of the lockdown, there wasn't any additional funding or resources, whereas the expectation from local authorities was still the same, to be able to support people and get them off the streets and put them into accommodation so that they are kept safe from the COVID. Unfortunately, the rhetoric doesn't follow up with any funding, and we haven't seen any strategy, any funding from the government in order for them to be able to fulfill one of their manifesto commitments that they made during the general election. And what we've had over the many years during this Tory government and previously Liberal Tory government is a very piecemeal approach to funding and a piecemeal approach towards tackling the issues of homelessness, which, as Nicola and Mike and both our charities have outlined, doesn't give us the ability to be able to develop long-term strategies and long-term solutions in order for us to be able to tackle this issue in a more meaningful way. And that's going to continue to be an issue for us. And whilst I say the government doesn't really follow up with the resources that's needed, what I do want to point out that as a council, we've been absolutely committed to this agenda, and we've actually, the budget share in terms of homelessness in Manchester is quite significant. And over the years, this Labour Council has continued to invest and support the homelessness services to be able to support some of our most vulnerable residents. What we do need is the government to give us that additional support. And you heard some of the issues earlier on around building houses, social housing. You know, we haven't had a house building program in this country for over a decade. And until we get that house building program to the scale that we need it to be, we will be putting people into temporary accommodation and not be able to move them into more permanent accommodation. And what we need this government to do is to really take what they say seriously. If they've made a manifesto commitment to end homelessness by 2024, they have got to put money into those support services like mental health, like addiction support services, and they've got to start a house building program that is to the scale that we need to be able to deal with the backlog of homeless people in this city and across Greater Manchester and the UK. So, you know, if anybody is listening from the government, and I think we can all do this from a council perspective, Parliament, if you made this commitment, we are committed to do this. Give us the resources and the tools that we need to be able to deliver on what is your manifesto promise.
Thank you. I've now got Councillor Kilpatrick.
Thanks, Leanne. I wanted to go to section 9 of the report, and it refers to temporary accommodation standards. And I think, you know, we all remember some of the reports from a couple of years ago now of the conditions in temporary accommodation across the city. And I appreciate that they'd have, you know, people chasing headlines are often going to the worst examples of it, but the report notes that visits made to temporary accommodation to assess housing standards under the HHSRS, which is the standards criteria within the Housing Act. There was obviously some difficulty to complete those visits due to the COVID situation. And I appreciate that you won't be able to answer a lot of these because they're quite specific questions, but I would appreciate maybe a follow-up note if possible, is just how many visits were successfully carried out. And of those visits, how many hazards were discovered? And with some hazards in that piece of legislation, which is a bit of a hobby horse of mine, there's obviously damp as a hazard. Obviously, when residents and people in temporary accommodation are forced due to the pandemic to self-isolate or stay within doors for a long period of time, that can have an impact on health, and because of increased exposure. And if there are any plans to look at that service and try and ramp that ability to complete those assessments up when it is possible, because obviously we need to know as soon as possible the impact of the exposure of any hazards within temporary accommodation. And then secondly, is just the specific point on people who have non-recourse to public funds. I noted that there was a specific provision that seemed pretty low. So these will be refugees, asylum seekers, etc., that wouldn't have traditional recourse to public fund. And I wondered if officers felt that was a suitable number of beds given historic demand for specifically that group.
Thank you. The officers can answer the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Kilpatrick. Yes, happy to provide a follow-up note to the details around successful visits. I think what one point I would just like to make is that during the pandemic, people have still been able to move and also to access support where they've required it. So our tenancy support service is still maintaining contact with people, and we were really successful in being able to move people, for example, out of bed and breakfast, or families out of bed and breakfast in the early part of the pandemic. We massively reduced the numbers, and so everybody will have guaranteed work, and if there is an issue in temporary accommodation, whether it's quality accommodation or any other issue, they will have a worker who they'll be able to contact for that. But we'll certainly provide that additional information back to you around the questions you asked on successful visits and hazards. Obviously, we'll just make the point there are different, as you clearly will know, different categories of hazards within that that have a different impact on people's well-being. In terms of the question around no recourse public funds, I guess it's a hard one to answer because in some ways the clue's in the description, as we cannot fund places for people with no recourse to public funds. So, for example, through the Bed Every Night programme, it's the Mayor's charity that's supporting that because that isn't public funding. It's long been a concern, I think, that people who fall out of the asylum system are effectively left destitute out on the streets of UK cities, and it's the charitable sector that will pick those up. And it does seem also perverse, and I wouldn't want to make a political point here, but to seek to end rough sleeping, but ensure that there is a class of people for whom there is no accommodation that they can access if there is no active voluntary sector in that community. And that is a real issue for us. We think that we're trying to strike a balance in terms of getting the right number of people who fall out of the asylum system. And one of the things that we have been really successful at is working with another of our voluntary sector partners, the Booth Centre, around enabling people to safely return home should they wish. That's predominantly EU non-working nationals with no who aren't exercising their treaty rights, to prevent them being in a position where they effectively have no choice but to sleep on the streets. And the residents of Manchester see people sleeping on the streets where there is actually no solution that we can find for them. So it's always a balance, and it is something that we do keep an eye on. We think it's probably broadly about right that we are reliant upon literally the charity of people in the city and our voluntary sector partners in that, and that will always be a concern for us.
You okay with that, Richard?
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. Just very quickly on the Housing Act stuff, it would be really good if as part of the response to that, you could let us know on any possible enforcement, and I appreciate that would be crossing directorates slightly. But obviously the HSSRS is specifically Housing Act enforcement. Often, as we've discussed at this committee before, the council will use the environment enforcement because it's quicker to get a response, but obviously the Housing Act would prevent us using any future temporary accommodation for this purpose. And I think that one thing we have to try and avoid is that once we've got a situation where temporary accommodation is being deemed to be hazardous, that we don't go back and reward those organised those people or companies that are providing temporary accommodation that is unsuitable.
Thank you. We'll get that follow-up information out to members. I've got Gavin and Azra to come back in, and then I'm just going to finish up with the homelessness as we've still got our next item to go through. So, Gavin?
Thank you, Leanne. Yeah, it's just regarding item 9 and the inspection of temporary accommodation Councillor Kilpatrick asked about. Obviously, it is a complex, long-standing issue that the Scrutiny Committee have raised before. Our slight concern is that over 24% of families and single people in dispersed temporary accommodation have lived in that for 2 or more years. So just concerned a little bit about how we're moving those families and single people from that temporary dispersed accommodation. And obviously just to reiterate the point about the inspections, it's good to see we've got 4 inspectors in a team now. But it looks like there's a bit of an issue with lack of access to some of the properties. And obviously we want to make sure that these properties are a suitable standard. But yeah, just about the long-standing 24%, what we're doing to try and reduce that, and has that 24% increased or decreased over the last couple of years? Thank you.
Azra, can you ask your questions now, and then Mike and Nicola can respond? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I want to come back on a bed every night. I'm just wondering, because of the pandemic and the social distancing rules, did that mean that there was a reduction of available beds? And if that was the case, what did we put in place? And the other thing is, will we be able to continue our support for a bed every night, considering the £50 million budget cuts facing Manchester this year and further proposed budget cuts for the following years? And I want to come back on the Protect programme. I'm extremely interested in this programme. I'd like to know more on whether or not the funding that was made available to address these complex issues will be enough to have a meaningful impact in Manchester, as 15 million across 20 local authorities doesn't equate to much funding to deliver such complex issues. And how much per capita are we expected to receive to deliver this new service? And is it going to offset the 20 million that we're going to lose from the health and social care budget?
Thank you. If the officers can respond.
Yeah, I'll just respond to Councillor White. So, yeah, we can get as part of, maybe if we do a single follow-up note around the change in proportion of people who've been in temporary accommodation for those years. If we can get that, we'll get that, so you can see that change year on year. There will always be an issue in terms of particularly larger families. So again, the committee will be aware of the attempts we've been making to ensure purchase of larger properties to enable that group of people to move out of temporary accommodation more quickly. What we have done is try to shift the resources in the directorate over a number of years, actually, towards enabling people to, ideally to prevent them coming in, but actually to get them out as quickly as possible. So that's included move-on services, and within the way we're looking to reorganise the directorate, we'll be corralling that into a single move-on service to make the most of accessing private rented property across the city and enabling people to access property that they wouldn't have considered. We've introduced auto bidding on the choice-based letting system. We've increased the take-up of affordable and quality private rented accommodation as a move-on and permanent rehousing option for people to enable them to move. If everybody in temporary accommodation waited just for social housing in an area that they wanted, we would probably treble our numbers in temporary accommodation within 2 months, and it would never shift. So we've recognised the need to do that, to enable people actually to move on with the next stage of their lives, to be honest, as much as anything. The other bit, I think, which did crop up slightly in terms of what Joe was saying earlier, was around some of the barriers to people accessing the Manchester Move system or getting into accommodation, which can have historical rent arrears. Sometimes they can be really easy things to fix, just to open doors for people to move on. So we're also looking at work through our support services to clear some of that stuff, to get people on payment plans, to make them a more attractive option to social and private landlords in the city. I'll certainly happily let Nicola go through the details of the Protect programme. She does them far better than I do. But just in terms of Councillor Ali and question around the bed every night, I mean, we are explicitly looking as to how we can plug the gap that we have in terms of the bed every night. That doesn't necessarily mean that we want to reduce the beds, but there might be options around how we can fund that without it being a net drain on the local budget. And we're looking very, very rapidly at that to ensure that we have a feasible bed every night programme. And actually, we've got a good number of beds through a bed every night at the moment. And I think, as the report mentions, we're also in conversation with the combined authority around their budget for a bed every night for next year. So we're also looking for clarity from them about what they can afford to pay us. Certainly, one of the impacts of COVID has been the move away, in partnership with our partners in the voluntary sector, from night shelter-based accommodation. And actually, sometimes it was the fear and loathing of night shelter-style accommodation, dormitory-style accommodation, that actually prevented some people wanting to come in off the streets. And actually, we've tried to change the profile of that programme to make it more COVID compliant. In terms of individual rooms, wherever possible, that's always the ideal, and that's something that we would want to retain as much as we possibly can do in the future. But I'll let Nicola go through the details of the Protect programme.
Nicola, due to the timing of the meeting now, we're on 3:15. Is it possible that you could send that as an update to us? I just want to make sure we go through compliance and enforcement as well.
That would be absolutely fine, not a problem.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Mike, Nicola and all the team who work on the homelessness. I'll let you come in, Lofty, wait a minute. It is amazing what you're doing, but it's horrendous that we're having to do so much work to support the most vulnerable with no money. And the members of the committee just all the time dread reading how some of the negative, but we do appreciate your hard work, and especially of the team and the voluntary sector. Councillor Rahman, you've got about 20 seconds, and then I need to do the recommendations and move on.
Okay, I'm just going to try and quickly sum up. I think Azra mentioned the budget cuts that are coming. We already know the pressures on the budget at the moment, and we've talked about some of those wraparound services that have been cut over the last 10 years. Clearly, with the stay on Section 21 being removed, there's going to be an increased pressure on the service, and at the same time, we're going to be having to make some very difficult budget decisions as well, which is no doubt going to have an impact on our ability to be able to support people who newly find themselves in a situation where they're homeless, but also the people that have been homeless for a period of time, and of course the rough sleeper community as well is going to have an impact. So, if what we actually need is, we need the government to give us the resources to be able to meet that demand, not ask us to make £50 million worth of cuts, which is going to make it extremely difficult for us to be able to tackle that. And I'll finish off on a final note. I think there was a mention of street begging earlier on, and I just want to make an appeal to members that we get this message out as far and wide as we possibly can. Giving people money, food, clothing, or other items on the street doesn't actually help, and we need to try and stop people from doing that and direct them to the charities and the services that can help them and give them the wraparound support that they need in order for them to be able to turn their lives around.
Thank you. The committee would like to note the report on the homelessness in the City of Manchester. We'd also like to make some recommendations. We'd like to recommend that for the March scrutiny, that the Housing Executive, Councillor Richards, brings an update on the allocations noted by Councillor Whiston. So what the updates are concerns at 3, 6 and 9 months. I think we're only been at the 6 months then. So we can go through and see what the challenges are there and is there anything we need to address, as stated in a previous meeting. That as a committee, we would like the Executive for Homelessness to write to the Minister to stress the details of Manchester and what we're actually dealing with, because it does have to come from us, and also to ask that all the MPs in Manchester write to stress how bad the homelessness situation is in our city, because if we're not prepared to ask them to do that, they're not going to even look at it. We've also got Greater Manchester as the biggest authority and with the biggest population and the highest figures in homelessness. Even though we are already supported by the Greater Manchester Mayor, I think it's important that we still again stress how important it is for us, because we haven't got the money, we haven't got the funds. So as part of this committee, that the Executive writes to those people, please, on our behalf and the rest of the Council. Also, it would be useful to have some of the information of all the contact details. We don't want everything across the city, but I think if we just have a few of the, not just rough sleeper teams, anything that could be open over the Christmas period, because people, it won't be running as normal, just so we've got some contacts. Otherwise, we're all going to be going through, looking for everything on the internet. If Nicola and the team's able to send that out to us, that would be great, and then over the Christmas period. So thank you everybody from the homelessness report, and we're now going to move on to item 6, which is enforcement and compliance. And I'm going to go straight into, Nicola, did you want to come in? No, okay. Going straight into enforcement and compliance, I'm going to go straight into questions. Can members indicate who wants to ask some questions on this, please? I know I had Azra. Azra, can you come in first?
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few questions. So on point 2.5, there seems to be, looking at the report, there seems to be continuous waste issues centred around North Manchester. I was just curious, what work has been done in this region, in this area, to reduce the referrals received? And has any work been done to identify the reasons? And the second one is, what work's been done in regards to the case study 2? What work has been done with the universities to ensure that students living in private properties are not engaging in antisocial behaviour?
Thank you. The officers can answer that question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. In relation to Councillor Ali's question about waste to start with, I think there's been significant amount of work done to tackle waste. One of the things that the committee specifically asked us to look at for this report was how some of the additional money had been used that had been given across to enable us to do more work around fly tipping. So we've employed sort of like additional staff with some of that money. We're using CCTV cameras. We've got additional CCTV cameras. We do a lot of work with our neighbourhood team colleagues around sort of like encouraging people to make correct use of the facilities that we have in Manchester. I mean, obviously in Manchester we're still one of the only authorities in the country that give bulky waste collections for free. So it's very unfortunate that people continue to fly tip. It's a very antisocial activity, and there is really no need for it in Manchester. And obviously whenever we find details of people who are fly tipping, we do take action against them. We will, wherever possible, you know, where we find evidence amongst anything that has been dumped, we will obviously take action to either issue fixed penalty notices or take prosecution action against those people. But unfortunately, we do still continue to see people dumping waste. You know, we've done specific projects. I think one of the case studies later on in the report refers to some of the work that we've done in Cheetham Hill. Another of the case studies refer to some work that we've done in West Didsbury. But we're doing those sort of projects across the city. But as long as people continue to fly tip, you know, it is going to be kind of an uphill battle. In relation to case study 2, I actually think that that's a good example of how we have worked with both the students, the residents in the area and the universities to take action before people actually hold parties that are going to cause disturbance in the neighbourhood. I think that's a good example of showing that the preemptive action that we've taken made sure that that particular party didn't go ahead, and that we did make it very, very clear to the students living in that property what would happen if, you know, they disregarded the advice that they'd been given not to go ahead, and thankfully in that case they took heed of the warnings, and we were able to ensure that something that would potentially have caused a lot of disturbance in that area didn't actually take place.
Is that okay, Azra?
That's fine, Chair, but I've got another 2. Do you want me to come in now or after?
Do it now.
On point 6.2, we're talking about the BIFA investigation team. I'm just curious, who exactly does this team consist of and what does it entail? And point 6.10, it's not just commercial waste we need to look at on the arterial route, but that we need to also focus on waste coming from the HMOs. What work are we intending to do with these? And looking at the appendix, can we have a breakdown of compliance enforcement activities by ward, please?
If you're able to respond to those, Fiona?
Yeah, sorry, Chair, I'm just flicking between the report, trying to find the bits that Councillor I was talking about and getting my mute button back off again. Yes, in relation to the first point, who are the BIFA team? The BIFA team basically are officers who they go out and they will sort of like clear waste that's been dumped, but what they'll do first is they'll look through it to see if there's any evidence, and what we will use from that is if there's any evidence that's found within the waste, we will follow that up, and wherever possible we'll take action against the people that have dumped the waste. But it's to enable, you know, us to get rid of sort of like fly-tipped waste much more quickly, but also to, because what used to happen sort of like in the olden days is we would, before the BIFA team, is, you know, sort of like the waste would be left until somebody could get out there to go through it themselves, whereas now we're able to sort of like get the evidence that we need from the waste but get it removed at the same time. In relation to the second point, which I'm sorry, I've forgotten what your second point was. Councillor Ali, could you
come back in, Azra?
That it wasn't just about commercial waste we need to look at on the arterial route, but that we need to also focus on waste coming from the HMOs. What work are we intending to do with these? And then looking at the appendix, can you give us a breakdown of compliance enforcement activities by ward?
Yes, in relation to HMOs, we've done quite a lot of work with HMOs in the area. I mean, I think the case studies, it was specifically focusing on what we were doing on the main arterial routes. I mean, obviously, if there was an HMO on that main arterial route that was causing a problem as well, they would be included as part of that project. But we work really closely, you know, with the landlords of the HMOs and obviously the residents of the HMOs as well, around, you know, ensuring that they've got as much responsibility as anybody else to make sure they dispose of their waste correctly. So where we have got any issues with HMOs in an area, we will sort of like look at what action we can take against them. And, you know, when we get, you know, information from residents, members, etc., if there's particular HMOs that are causing problems, we will always investigate those. But we've done quite a lot of work with particularly where we've got what we call portfolio landlords who perhaps own more than one HMO, and we'll do some work with them around what they need to do if they've got particularly problematic residents. In relation to giving you compliance and enforcement breakdowns by wards, we can do that. I think you already get through the ward reports that we send out. You should get a lot of that already, but if there's specific other information that's not being provided at a ward level, I will be very happy to provide that. In terms of a report like this, it'd be really difficult to do everything broken down by ward because you'd end up with a really massive report. But of course, any information that members want by ward, we can provide that for you.
Thank you. I've now got Richard.
Thanks, Chair. 2 questions. Thanks for the report. It always seems to be the things that we get emailed about on a regular basis, all written down on one piece of paper. So thanks for that. In particular, I liked the increase in complaints of dogs barking. But there's 2 big issues that, I mean, I know that my ward is mentioned, and I wanted to make the question more generic around commercial waste. But where you've got commercial waste alongside residential waste in district centres, which is the example from West Tisbury that is in the report. First off, big thank you to the Neighbourhoods teams, because it is the hands-on work of Diane, particularly my ward, and I'm sure it's going to be the case across all members, that really put in the work to ensure that enforcement works really smoothly there. So I just wanted to pay tribute to them. But it is a regular issue that is partly due to obviously resident turnover. So I'm interested that you mentioned work done with landlords, but I was wondering if there's any specific work that you do with letting agents as well, because often residents will have zero contact with their landlords, but much more regular contact with their letting agents in order to make sure that transition between a transient population and what is required of them for their bins, for example, is well known. And on top of that, the impact of particular terrace housing, and I say this a lot to my neighbour team, but there are examples now where 3 bins, possibly with a food caddy, maybe even more, where bins are kept in storages, etc., where the enforcement action that is then taken is a bin reset, and often it leaves residents losing bins. And again, that causes a little bit of upset and confusion, and etc. And what specific work can be done to again target just that specific property type? And I think I've said to Councillor Akbar before in the past, of my view, that I think that there needs to be specific waste policies specific for terrace housing that's different to the rest of the area, but I appreciate that as a specific policy that we need to pursue. On section 6.4, 6.5, 6.6, which is CCTV and the use of fly tipping enforcement. I just had a question of clarification, really, which is that it states that there's been 96 cases of which CCTV has been involved, of which 4 are going to trial, but that the process has been delayed due to obviously COVID and the impact of capacity in the courts. I wanted to know if that 4 is, of the overall cases, how many will end up going to court due to other issues such as fake plates, etc., and not having enough evidence, or whether that's just 4 of the 96 are currently in the court process and there will be more added onto that. Because otherwise, it would translate to about a 5% success rate of CCTV cases, which just comes across as a bit low, especially as I'm sure is the case in all wards. There has been work in my area for CCTV footage, and we haven't had a successful example yet, and obviously the problem persists.
Thank you. If you could answer those, Fiona. Fiona?
Cardinal sin, I didn't put my my mic back on. Sorry about that. Yeah, in relation to commercial waste alongside residential waste, yes, this can be quite a challenging issue. And to be honest with you, we'll work with whoever we need to work with, in that area. So if there's key lettings agents, then yes, we will work with the lettings agents as well as the landlords, because the key thing that we're doing is we're looking for whoever can help us to resolve the problems in the area. So yes, we will will work alongside lettings agents as well as landlords. In terms of the impact of terraced housing, we've tried lots of different strategies over the years in relation to terraced housing, and I know that we've used container bins in some areas where we've had difficulties with there being a lot of individual bins. I mean, obviously a lot of residents prefer to have their individual bins, and it can work really well in areas with terraced housing. We've got lots of areas with terraced housing across the city who manage their bins very well. So it's really kind of like where we've got sort of like ongoing problems, where we've got sort of like issues with terraced housing, where, you know, we will look at sort of like what are the key specific things that we can do in that particular area, and it will, you know, involve working with, you know, sort of like where there's obviously where there's businesses alongside it, it can be quite challenging if we've got sort of like, if we've got businesses misusing sort of like residential bins, or if we've got residents misusing commercial bins, then what we try to do is to work with all of the different sort of like parties that are involved in that, and it will be the usual, it'll be a combination of enforcement action and trying to sort of like appeal to people's better nature to, you know, for want of a better expression, around getting them to, you know, to take care of the waste provision that they've been given. In relation to the final question on CCTV, I'm going to bring my colleague Mark Warmisham in on that one. I do think that there are more cases that will be going to trial. I know that we've got 4 that are in the court process at the moment, but just so that I don't give misinformation to the committee, can I bring Mark Warmisham in on that point?
Hello. Yes, of the 96 cases, obviously at the moment we're saying in the report that 9 are pending with the courts, but we expect a lot more than that to go forward. With some of the fly tipping cases, we do have difficulties in finding who the perpetrators are. There is quite a trend at the moment that if you've got a vehicle, some of these will go onto Gumtree, get a duplicate plate, put them on, or if it's the dead of night, no plates whatsoever. So it's quite difficult tracking down your large fly tippers. On some of those cases, we may take PACE interviews, and we may think that a fine is a better course of action than going through the courts. That's where it's more low-level fly tipping. So hopefully, I don't know if there's any more questions around that at all, if that answers your questions, but certainly there'll be more than 4 cases going forward. We have the problem with the courts closing down over lockdown, so that's kind of slowed the process down for us at the moment.
Thank you. Are you okay with that, Richard?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Thank you. I've got Gavin.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. Just to welcome the Fallowfield and Withington pub watch scheme detailed in 2.9 as a case study. That has been really welcomed locally for us. And also item 7, the licensing and out of hours team, and what they've done to tackle noise complaints during lockdown. I do still have some concerns around the advertising of that service and how it's communicated to residents. But I know I've raised that before, and I think that's an ongoing issue. My question's around item 4.5. In the table of fees, it documents that we've collected £182,692 related to 325 fly tipping prosecutions, which is welcome that action has been taken. What happens to that money, and is that put back into the fly tipping service? Thank you.
If the officers can respond.
No, unfortunately, in relation to prosecutions, the Treasury keeps the money, not the council. FPNs, the City Council keeps the money, and yes, that does go back into waste-related work, but not prosecutions.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other members? I've got some questions. Is there any other members that like to ask a question?
Yes, Chair. I think I put it quite a long time ago. But
Sorry, Naeem, you go.
Yeah, my question on Appendix 1, Item 6, when I see the figures of fly tipping in Chitham Ward, I just like to see the breakdown, because Chitham Ward is the largest ward in the city, but I've got wholesale district and the Bury New Road area. It looks like all that is in that area. I'd like to see breakdown in residential and the commercial area. If somebody could provide me that, please.
Do you want me to come back in, Chair? Yes.
Yes, Fiona.
Yeah, of course we can do sort of like a greater breakdown for Councillor Hassan on the actual parts of of his ward where there's fly tipping, but I can say it isn't only in the Strangeways area. There is sort of like quite a lot of fly tipping in a lot of the alleyways, unfortunately, in Cheetham Hill and sort of like around some of the commercial provision as well. So yes, there is an issue in Strangeways, but there is a lot of fly tipping happening in other parts of the ward as well, both domestic and commercial.
Is that okay, Naeem?
Yeah, well, also our request is this: we got this law CCTVs. I mean, if we got this problem here, can we not just run a pilot scheme here to put law CCTV? I mean, cameras or covert cameras in the area to catch this. I mean, people. Otherwise, looking at the figures from it's 3 years now, and the figures not come down at all. So we need to do something in this area to control this. It's the highest figures in the city, and especially from 3 years is the same figures coming up. We're not controlling, or we're not doing something different. We need to try something different now to control this.
I'm fairly sure we have used CCTV in Cheetham Hill, and we have done some of the project work in Cheetham Hill as well. I do agree with you, the figures in Cheetham Hill are very high, and it's disappointing to see that they're remaining high. Obviously we will look at whether or not there are other parts of the area where they would benefit from CCTV. Clearly CCTV is most effective where it's people who are doing the dumping in a vehicle, because then you're getting the registration plate. Hopefully it's a registration plate which isn't cloned. But sort of like if it's just individuals, it's much harder to be able to identify who that is, unless you can sort of like see them coming out of their house and dumping things. But yes, by all means, I'll get Mark Wormisham to make contact with you directly, Naeem, and look at where we can where there's specific issues that we might want to spend a bit more time on in Cheetham Hill.
Thank you.
Chair, can I just come in on that?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Naeem, obviously, Councillor Hassan, you raise a valid point, and I think one of the things we are going to try to do differently is, because Cheetham is a very diverse ward, so the waste and recycling team are looking at a communication project which will address some of the language barriers and put out videos and maybe leaflets in different languages to kind of educate certainly some of the residents in terms of how to manage their waste more responsibly and recycle more. And hopefully that should help reduce some of the kind of waste issues that arise in passageways, which you've highlighted.
Thank you. I've got a few questions. Obviously, as the council looks to looking at budget cuts, we look at our most vulnerable in the city, and even though the neighbourhoods has been cut over the last 10 years, we still need to run some of our statutory services, obviously. We did have investment into compliance and enforcement, in which you did have cameras and other things to help with the issues. I just wondered, is there any more possibilities of funding for more cameras, i.e. for the north, where there seems to be much more fly tipping than any other area of the city? Also, on the COVID-19 figures for wards, so what actually was the COVID-19 for the out-of-hours team, and what was the main issues? How are you going to cope with the release of lockdown if it is on the 16th? What's that impact going to be on our offices with venues reopening, and how will we be able to cope, because we just don't have enough staff? And what's our priority for the next year with enforcement and compliance? Because if we are looking at cuts, we're not going to be able to reduce figures if the public don't engage with us and not fly tip. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, in relation to your first question, I'm not sure that's really one for me to answer. More investment in the service, I would love more investment in the service. With the cameras we've got, we've we've used the investment that we've been given to purchase cameras, and we're using them where we've got the greatest needs. One of the things that we always do within our service as well is look for, like grant funding to be able to bring more funding into the service. But like Nicola said on the previous report, short-term funding isn't the best. It isn't the best way to sort of like achieve long-term sustainable change. But wherever there's opportunities for more investment, we will always look for them. In terms of your question about COVID-19 figures, the appendix that we've given in relation to licensed out of hours sets out the work that the licensed out of hours team dealt with during the first lockdown, and what we saw there was we saw clearly the biggest increase was in noise, mainly in domestic noise, because people were spending much more time in their homes. So that was kind of like the biggest call on their resources at that point in time. Obviously since that point in time when things started to reopen, we did spend a lot more time helping businesses to manage complying with the new regulations, and obviously taking enforcement action where we had to. But it's getting that balance, isn't it, between ensuring that businesses know what they need to do so they are able to comply with the law, and sort of like helping those that that need the help to comply, and then coming down much harder on those who are just basically being flagrantly abusing the legislation. If we move into tier 2 on the 16th, what we will do is we'll stand back up the licensing and out of hours team. The hours that they're working at the moment would enable them to deal with issues arising from that anyway. I think tier 2 is similar to tier 3 that we were in before we went into lockdown, so there won't be a huge amount of difference for the officers there. They have continued, because it's not only licensed premises that they're dealing with, they are dealing with other issues as well. So they are working up till 11 o'clock during the week and 12 o'clock at the weekends at the moment, but we will step them back up to do whatever shift systems that we need them to do, getting back closer to sort of like their normal shift system if the what we're finding in the neighbourhoods requires that to happen. In relation to priorities for next year, they'll be very similar to our priorities for this year, because depending clearly on what happens with the pandemic, we will have to sort of like, one of the things I think which I've said in the report is we've shown how flexible we can be. We've had to sort of like flex the way that we work, and dealing with the sort of like the pandemic has been a huge part of the work that all of our service actually has had to do. We've had to sort of like have people from different teams helping out across the piece, particularly in the areas where environmental health would normally pick things up, because a lot of those staff have been diverted on to dealing with the contact tracing, and actually dealing with the public health response. So waste will always, while we've got waste related issues, that will remain a priority. Hopefully some of the work that we're doing from a communications perspective that Councillor Akbar just referred to, hopefully that will help in terms of making people manage their waste more, more responsibly, because at the end of the day, we're having to take action because people are not doing the right thing, and we really need to sort of like, through some of the communication work that's done across the city, to get people to sort of like manage their waste responsibly. They are given the ability to do that through the services that we provide through waste and recycling, and it's just about sort of like getting them to really sort of like take on board that they need to take on that responsibility for managing their waste and on the commercial side, and we will do everything we can to help people do that, but at the end of the day we will continue to take enforcement action where we need to. Does that answer your questions okay?
Thank you, Fiona. It does. It's very good. The one thing I didn't understand until Fiona well pointed out is, could you just tell the difference between what the council are responsible during COVID and what the police are responsible for? Because a lot of the time the public, just so they're clear, so like obviously we've had universities and stuff, just so they have an idea of what we would deal with as a council.
Yeah, I mean, most of our work is very much focused on businesses. and the police are focused on, the gatherings. So like kind of like if people are gathering in private houses or people are gathering in public, the police would deal with those issues. Where we've got businesses who are not complying with the legislation, we would deal with those. We work very closely with the police around the student issues. And we've also, our antisocial behaviour team are also working very closely with the police when they've had to break up gatherings at private houses. We also look whether or not there's any action we can take from an antisocial behaviour perspective as well. So that's kind of like the simplistic split is we deal with businesses, police deal with people, but it's not quite as simplistic as that.
Thank you. Councillor Akbar?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just want to touch on a couple of points. Councillor right at the start talked about the waste issues in the north, and I think Fiona kind of mentioned the extra investment. One of the things obviously we are doing is a target hardening project. North has had target hardening projects where there have been fly tipping hotspots, and those have certainly worked. But some of the challenges is around the passageways, and I think the passageway project work that certainly should help. And I've already mentioned the different communication strategy. In terms of Councillor Kilpatrick's about terrace housing, actually 4 main terrace households manage their waste reasonably well, and they have up to about 50% recycling rates. Where we do have the challenges is where you've got terrace housing and they've got communal containers. And I think, again, the passageway project work and some of the extra work that BIFA are going to be doing over the next couple of months, the different ways of working passages, hopefully should alleviate some of those issues. Your point about investments, absolutely right, Councillor Igbon. I mean, if we didn't have to make these extra cuts, then you could always look at how you can manage your resources most effectively going forward. But certainly, at the moment, we're not in a position to make any cuts, and certainly to this compliance enforcement service. And just to add, finish off, I think the report I don't want to go over what it says in the report, but I think, again, you touched upon it, how we're going to go forward and how we're going to manage this service if we go into tier 2. I think one of the strengths of this service has been their agility, their ability to adapt and be flexible during the last kind of year or so, when their hours have changed, the shifts have changed, the priorities have changed, the focus has changed, the partnership working, and that really needs to be commended. And I think everybody agree. I think communications and certainly clarity and guidance has not been one of the strengths of this government, but the teams in compliance enforcement had to interpret that guidance, digest it, then go out there, speak to our residents and speak to our businesses and tell them what them rules actually mean. So I'd like to really make sure that thanks is noted in the minutes for the report. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to finish off with a recommendation. The committee do note the report. My recommendation is that we carry on through the neighbourhoods of doing that engagement we've not been able to do this year. So next year, that every ward, which you already do, that we continue that neighbourhood engagement, but also making sure that our housing providers and our obviously private sector work with us in the universities, because it's not something we can do on our own. So I think that recommendation is still there, but I think the engagement and that communication to residents, as we know, is always critical, but getting out there on a one-to-one probably from about May, that we make sure that we do that, so we can try and at least reduce some of the fly tipping or make people aware of that, so we can help with that. So I'd like to thank the officers for the report and all the hard work you've done, especially during COVID, because I know it's not been easy, and still doing the normal day-to-day like licensing as well. I know that is very difficult, and there's been lots of other issues going on. I'd like to thank everybody on the neighbourhoods team. I'd like to thank Andrew, who's done the technician, because it's not easy on this platform to do these meetings, and we've changed over from our computers, so it's very difficult there. I'd like to thank Lee Walker, who supports me on the scrutiny. You don't realise how hard it is. It's not that straightforward. And Fiona and Michael, who are essential to all this coming together. On behalf of the committee, we would like to wish all the people in neighbourhoods who help us, from the homelessness to everybody in the housing, highways, in a very strange year. Let's hope for 2021. The next scrutiny will be a lot better than this year. And thank you very much. We're going to move on to our overview work programme to see what we're going to put in for the rest of this year. Any of the members want to come in with an item we'd like to suggest for February? Annette?
Yeah, Chair, it seems like we're definitely not going to be having our climate change subcommittee, so I think we should have a whole meeting to discuss that and discuss our action plan and where we've got to towards our targets.
Yeah, I think we've got space in the February meeting to bring that back. Last time we had a meeting would be nearly a year ago. Do you want to do that based on where we travel from and to, or each point of the emergency that was put to Manchester?
I think we should both have an update on all the points of the motion, and also we should look at where we were at with the full action plan at the point we last looked at it and where we're at with it now.
Right, I think we agree. Any other members, do you support this? Because obviously we still need to be reaching them targets. Dates for that.
I think that's fine, Lee.
Yeah.
I'm happy with that.
Right, Lee, can we put that in? Yeah, brilliant. Lee, can we put that on for Feb?
Certainly, Chair, noted.
Yeah. I did mention in the meeting with the homelessness to bring the allocations back. We're looking at March, that's the last free date, because obviously we've got the budget next, we have got the climate change, we bring it back in March, a report of where we're up to on that with the allocations. So that will just give where we are at 3, 6 and 9 months, I think we're only at the 6. There is space for something else on there, isn't there, Lee?
Yes, Chair, currently there's nothing else listed on the March meeting other than the allocations policy report update that you just mentioned now.
Fiona, have you got anything to recommend?
There will be the budget reports coming back because March Executive will be signing off and full council, so there will be budget reports on the agenda for March.
Okay.
Can we have an update report on landlord licensing at some point as well?
Would we be able to get that information for that March meeting? That gives it long enough time?
I think so, yeah, there should be no problem with that.
If not, it can be after, but we've not had that for a while, have we?
Yeah,
so,
did we not have that in, was it September?
September. I think we did on the whole
I think we said we'd come back with it, didn't we? And there was a few, I can't remember the detail now, but I'm sure there was a few things, Leanne, that
yeah, I'm sure.
I think there were increase in the areas and stuff, and it was just to review. I'd have to go back to the minutes, but I'm sure we said about bringing it back within 6 months again.
Me and Lee will have a look and we'll bring that back. I think because obviously we want the climate change in the budget, we want to give them all enough time. We've got the planning on the highways as well. That's coming back.
It can be May. I mean, whenever we meet next meet, it's fine. It's just keep that on the table for at some point in the next phase then.
It should be fine. With them items aren't substantial, so it should be okay. Looking at that, if not, we can put it into the next municipal year. Is everybody else okay? Anything else to add to the overview? We've got enough. So if you've anything in particular, we need to get the information to the officers because they have to collate. I think we know with the climate change, because everything's there, we can see that. Obviously, with the allocations, it's the up-to-date from what Susanna had said. So Lee will send out that to the exec members and the officers. So I think that's it for the December meeting. Yeah? Well, au revoir. I will see you all. Maybe I can see you next year for real. Thank you for your time and have some kind of normality at Christmas. I'm going to stay on the line to speak to Lee and Fiona. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Thank you, Chair.
And happy Christmas.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye.